"You are nothing but filth beneath our feet." The words hit like shards of ice against exposed flesh. Lyra felt them carve themselves into the spaces between her ribs, joining the collection of similar cruelties that had taken up permanent residence there. The kitchen overseer, Madame Vrex, stood above her with arms crossed, watching as Lyra scrubbed the stone floor with practised efficiency. Her knees had long since gone numb against the cold granite. The brush in her hands moved in steady circles, soap and water swirling away the evidence of the morning's feast preparations. She kept her head down, silver blonde hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. That had always been enough. Stay small, stay quiet, stay invisible. "Are you listening to me, girl?" Madame Vrex's boot connected with Lyra's shoulder, not hard enough to truly hurt, but enough to remind her of her place in the world's cruel hierarchy. "The claiming ceremony is in 3 days. The entire Northern Palace will be watching when the unmated alphas choose their mates." Lyra's brush never stopped moving. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. "Even servants must attend," Madame Vrex continued, her voice dripping with the particular brand of malice reserved for those who had never known true powerlessness. "For spectacle purposes, you understand, so the nobles can see the difference between worthy females and the refuse that serves them." The cold stone beneath Lyra's palm seemed to grow colder, frost forming in delicate patterns that she didn't notice. Her wolf had been silent for so long that she had nearly forgotten it existed, buried somewhere deep where even she couldn't reach it. "You will serve wine during the ceremony," Madame Vrex said, already turning away. "Try not to trip and embarrass us all, though I suppose even your clumsiness might provide entertainment for our betters." Lyra waited until the overseer's footsteps faded before allowing herself to breathe. The great hall would be filled with hundreds of pack members, nobles, and unmated females dressed in their finest clothes. She would move along the walls like a shadow, refilling goblets and remaining unseen. She was good at that. She had spent 22 years perfecting the art of invisibility. The claiming ceremony was the most important event in the Northern Kingdom's social calendar. Powerful alphas would choose their mates from the eligible females presented before them, cementing political alliances and strengthening bloodlines. It was a display of hierarchy in its purest form, where worth was measured in bloodline purity and supernatural strength. Lyra possessed neither. She finished scrubbing the floor and moved to the enormous hearth, where pots of stew hung over the fire. The heat felt good against her always cold skin, and she allowed herself a moment to warm her hands before someone noticed her idleness. The kitchen bustled around her with pre-ceremony preparations, but no one spoke to her directly. She was furniture, part of the background that made their world function smoothly. That night, alone in the servants' quarters she shared with 3 other girls, Lyra stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the ceremony. The other servants whispered excitedly about which alpha might choose them, spinning fantasies about escaping their station through supernatural recognition. Lyra knew better than to dream. She had never shifted, never felt the wolf that supposedly lived inside every person born to the Northern Kingdom. The healers said some bloodlines were simply too weak, too diluted by generations of servitude. She was proof of that theory, they claimed, a wolfless anomaly in a world ruled by beasts. What they didn't know, what she didn't understand, was that her wolf wasn't absent. It was sleeping, deep beneath layers of magic so old and powerful that it had become part of her bones. Something stirred. Ancient power recognized the approaching change, felt the pull of destiny drawing near like winter winds carrying the scent of snow. But Lyra felt none of it. She only felt the familiar ache of knowing she would never be chosen, never be claimed, never be anything more than the servant girl who scrubbed floors and served wine to her betters. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing. Tomorrow, everything would change. The beast of the north was coming home. The great hall had been transformed into a cathedral of ice and starlight. Where once there had been simple stone walls, now crystalline formations rose like frozen waterfalls, each surface reflecting and refracting light until the entire space seemed to glow from within. Aurora patterns danced across the ceiling in blues and silvers and pale gold, responding to Lyra's emotional state with the kind of beauty that took breath away and left witnesses speechless. She stood at the hall's centre, no longer the servant girl who had once scrubbed these floors, but Queen Lyralee of the Winter Court in all her terrible and magnificent glory. The northern crown rested on her silver hair like it had been forged specifically for her head, and the ceremonial gown she wore seemed to be cut from captured moonlight and winter storms. Every noble in the kingdom knelt before her. "Rise," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in the bones of everyone present. "You came here tonight expecting to witness either a coronation or a funeral. Instead, you have seen the return of the Winter Court to its rightful place of power." The assembled nobility rose as one, their movements careful and respectful in the presence of magic that could reshape reality with a thought. Lady Seraphina was notably absent from the gathering, having been escorted from the kingdom under armed guard with instructions never to return upon pain of death. Oracle Matthias stepped forward from the crowd, carrying an object wrapped in silk that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "The sceptre of seasons," he announced formally, "last wielded by your mother, Queen Lysandra of the Winter Court. It has waited 23 years for your hand." He unwrapped the ancient artifact with reverent care, revealing a staff of crystallized winter magic topped with a star that held captive Aurora. The moment Lyra's fingers closed around it, the great hall filled with power that made every witness take an involuntary step backward. She was no longer just a queen by right of blood. She was a Winter Court ruler at the height of her magical strength, connected to forces that had shaped kingdoms and commanded the very weather itself. "The coronation is complete," Oracle Matthias declared, his ancient voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Long live Queen Lyralee, first of her name, ruler of the Northern Kingdom, heir to the Winter Court, and rightful sovereign of all lands touched by snow and ice." "Long live the Queen!" the crowd responded in unison, their voices echoing off crystalline walls in harmonies that sounded almost like song. But Lyra's attention was focused on a single figure standing at the edge of the gathering, golden eyes reflecting the aurora light that danced around her. The Beast King watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read, pride mixed with something that might have been loss, love complicated by the political realities that now separated them. She gestured slightly, ice crystals forming in the air to carry her unspoken message across the space between them. "Stay." He inclined his head in acknowledgement but didn't move closer. The mate bond still hummed between them, but it was different now, changed by everything that had been revealed and everything she had become. She was no longer the broken girl who needed his protection. She was a queen who commanded power in her own right. The question was whether there was still room for love in a relationship built on such fundamentally altered ground. "The Southern Kingdom's envoys have requested an audience," Oracle Matthias said quietly, drawing her attention back to the immediate political necessities. "They wish to formally withdraw their previous ultimatum and negotiate new treaties." "Of course they do," Lyra replied, with a smile that held no warmth. "Fear has a way of clarifying diplomatic priorities. Tell them I will receive their envoys tomorrow at noon. They may present their proposals on their knees, as befits subjects petitioning their sovereign." Gasps echoed through the hall at the implication. The Southern Kingdom had always been considered an equal power, a potential conqueror that demanded respectful treatment. But the queen who stood before them now commanded magic that could freeze armies in their tracks and call winter storms from clear skies. Diplomatic equality was no longer a relevant concept. "Your Majesty," one of the Northern Kingdom's council members stepped forward, his face carefully neutral. "What of the irregularities that were revealed before the combat trial, the questions about your upbringing, the circumstances of your family's death?" Lyra studied him with ice-blue eyes, that seemed to see straight through political manoeuvring to the fear beneath. "What questions?" she asked, her tone dangerously quiet. "The allegations about the Beast King's involvement are irrelevant," she cut him off, frost forming in the air around her as power responded to emotion. "I am queen by right of blood, proven by magical trial and confirmed by combat victory. The past is dead. Anyone who wishes to live in the present will focus on serving the crown that now rules this kingdom." Her gaze swept across the assembled nobles, marking those who looked uncertain, those who seemed to be calculating new political equations, those who were clearly planning to test her resolve in the coming days. "However," she continued, her voice carrying enough power to make the crystalline walls sing in harmony, "anyone who believes the Winter Court has grown soft during our years in exile is welcome to challenge that assumption. The arena remains available for those who prefer action to whispered doubts." The silence that followed was profound. "I thought not," she said with satisfaction. "Oracle Matthias, please escort our guests to their quarters. The coronation feast will be held tomorrow evening, giving everyone time to adjust to our new reality." The crowd began to disperse, nobles bowing formally, before retreating to discuss this dramatic shift in power. Within minutes, the great hall was empty, except for 3 figures standing among the ice sculptures that had spontaneously formed during the ceremony: Lyra, Oracle Matthias, and the Beast King. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and complicated emotions. Finally, Oracle Matthias cleared his throat. "I should leave you two to discuss whatever needs discussing," he said diplomatically. "But first, Your Majesty, there is something you need to know about the mate bond." Lyra tensed, wondering what other revelations were about to complicate her life. "What about it?" "It's not just supernatural recognition," he explained. "It's a magical connection that grows stronger over time, linking 2 souls at the deepest level. But it can only reach its full potential when both parties are complete individuals in their own right." She frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning that what you're feeling right now, this sense that the bond has changed, become more complex, is actually it evolving into its mature form. You were never meant to be dependent on him for strength or identity. The bond was waiting for you to become who you were always meant to be." Oracle Matthias bowed formally to both of them. A queen and a king, ruling as equals rather than protector and protected, if you choose that path. Then he was gone, leaving them alone among the ice and starlight. The Beast King approached slowly, his movements careful and respectful in a way that acknowledged her new status. When he stopped before her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his ancient eyes, he did something that stole her breath away. He knelt. "My queen," he said formally, bowing his head in a gesture of absolute submission, "I offer you my loyalty, my service, and my life to do with as you will." "Stand up," she said quietly, ice crystals swirling around them both as power responded to emotional complexity. "You don't kneel to me, not ever." He rose but remained silent, waiting for her to set the terms of whatever they were going to become. "I know about the treaty," she said finally. "I know about your involvement, however peripheral, in the events that led to my family's death. I know that politics and survival and 800 years of ruling have left marks on your soul that will never fully heal." His expression didn't change, but she felt his tension through the bond that connected them. "I also know," she continued, "that you spent decades searching for me, that you burned the treaty rather than profit from my family's destruction, that you've protected me and trained me and loved me even when you thought it might destroy us both." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that centuries of responsibility had carved there. "The servant girl you saved might have needed a perfect hero," she said softly. "But the queen I've become can love a man who's made mistakes and learned from them. The question is whether you can love a woman who doesn't need saving." Instead of answering with words, he pulled her against him with desperate strength, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of winter storms and ancient promises. The mate bond flared to life between them, stronger than it had ever been, connecting two complete souls who had chosen each other not out of need, but out of recognition. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw wonder in his golden eyes. "My fierce queen," he murmured against her hair, "I have waited 800 years not for someone to save, but for someone strong enough to stand beside me as an equal." "Then marry me," she said, surprising herself with the boldness of the proposal. Not because political necessity demands it, not because the mate bond compels it, but because we choose it. Because I love you and you love me, and together we can build something better than either of us could create alone. His smile was brighter than the aurora dancing across the ceiling. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes to all of it." Outside the great hall, winter settled over the northern kingdom like a benediction. Snow began to fall, not the harsh blizzard of supernatural power unleashed, but the gentle precipitation of a season arriving exactly when it was meant to. In the crystalline palace that had spontaneously formed around their joy, a queen and her chosen king began planning a wedding that would unite not just two hearts, but two ancient bloodlines whose combined strength would reshape the very foundations of power in their world. The Winter Court had returned, and it would never fall again. 6 months had transformed the Northern Kingdom into something that existed halfway between dream and legend. Lyra stood on the highest balcony of the Winter Palace, a structure that had grown from the ground itself through her magic, crystalline spires reaching toward the sky like frozen lightning, and looked out over a realm that flourished under her rule. Snow fell in gentle patterns that she unconsciously controlled, each flake finding its perfect place in the tapestry of winter that had become her signature across the landscape. The kingdom had never been more prosperous. Trade routes that had been dangerous for decades were now protected by barriers of beneficial ice that turned hostile weather into gentle passage. Crops grew larger and stronger in soil that her magic had enriched with minerals drawn from deep winter caves. Even neighbouring kingdoms sent tribute and requests for alliance, recognising that opposing the Winter Court's return would be both futile and catastrophically expensive. She was no longer the servant girl who had scrubbed floors and served wine to her betters. That person felt like someone she had known in another lifetime, a character from a story told to explain how queens were born from impossible circumstances. "Deep thoughts," Kieran's voice came from behind her, carrying the warmth that had become as essential to her happiness as breathing. She turned to find her husband approaching with the fluid grace that still made her heart skip after months of marriage. The Beast King, though she rarely thought of him by that title anymore, had changed as well during their time together. The ancient wariness that had marked him for centuries had softened into something more peaceful, as though 800 years of waiting had finally been justified. "Reflecting on how far we've come," she said, moving into his arms with the kind of natural ease that came from knowing exactly where she belonged. 6 months ago, I was invisible. Today, kingdoms send envoys to request meetings they'll consider themselves lucky to receive. Regrets? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Only that it took so long. She leaned against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm. Though I suppose I needed to be ready for all of this. The servant girl wouldn't have known what to do with a crown. The servant girl was always a queen, he corrected gently. She just needed the right circumstances to remember who she was. Through the palace windows below them, Lyra could see the daily bustle of a court that ran with the kind of efficiency that made other kingdoms envious. Nobles who had once dismissed her now competed for her attention. Servants who had worked alongside her in the kitchens now bowed when she passed, their faces showing not just respect, but genuine affection for a ruler who understood their struggles intimately. She had not forgotten where she came from. That knowledge informed every decision she made. "The Southern Kingdom's tribute arrived this morning," Kieran reported, his arm tightening around her waist. Gold, gems, and a formal request to negotiate new trade agreements, along with a rather eloquent apology for their previous diplomatic miscalculations. Lyra smiled at the diplomatic language. 6 months ago, the Southern Kingdom had threatened war if she claimed the Northern Crown. Today they sent treasure and begged for favourable treatment. Fear, she had learned, was indeed a powerful motivator for international cooperation. "And the internal matters?" she asked. "The last of the noble families who questioned your legitimacy have either sworn new oaths of loyalty or found reasons to relocate to distant holdings," he said with satisfaction. "Your rule is secure, beloved. No one doubts your authority any more." "Good." She turned in his arms to face him fully, seeing her own contentment reflected in his golden eyes. "Because I have news that makes our future even more secure." Something in her tone made him go very still, his ancient instincts recognizing the weight of whatever she was about to reveal. "Oracle Matthias confirmed it this morning," she continued, placing her hand over her still flat stomach. "The Winter Court bloodline will continue. Our child carries magic from both our lineages, Winter and Shapeshifter, royal authority and primal strength." The transformation of his expression was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Shock gave way to wonder, wonder to fierce joy, and joy to a kind of protective love, so intense it made the mate bond between them flare with golden light. "A child," he breathed, his large hand covering hers against her stomach. "Our child. The strongest magical bloodline this kingdom has seen in over 1,000 years, she agreed, leaning into his touch. "Oracle Matthias says the power readings are unlike anything in recorded history. We're not just continuing our respective legacies, we're creating something entirely new." Kieran's kiss was everything she had hoped for, desperate and tender, and filled with promises about the future they would build together. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw tears in his eyes. 800 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. 800 years of believing I would never have a family, never have children to carry forward what I've built. And now? Now you have a wife who loves you and a child on the way who will inherit the strongest magical bloodline in the known world, she finished for him, not to mention a kingdom that grows stronger every day under our joint rule. They stood together on the balcony, looking out over snow-covered lands that sparkled with health and prosperity. In the distance, Lyra could see the training grounds where young nobles learned to channel their supernatural abilities under the guidance of masters who understood that power without wisdom was merely destruction waiting to happen. Her kingdom, her husband, her child growing within her, her magic that could reshape weather patterns and call aurora from clear skies. "I spent my whole life being told I was nothing," she said quietly, ice crystals forming in the air around them to catch the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. Every day, in 100 different ways, I was reminded that I was worthless, invisible, less than the shadows that real people cast. "And now?" Kieran asked, though he could probably guess where her thoughts were leading. "Now I know that being told you're nothing doesn't make it true," she replied, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from having tested her worth against impossible odds and emerged victorious. "It just means the people saying it can't recognize power when it's standing right in front of them." The child in her womb seemed to respond to her emotional state, sending a flutter of movement that made her breath catch. Already she could sense the magic building within the tiny life, winter storms and shapeshifter strength and royal authority that would one day rule kingdoms and reshape the boundaries of what was possible. "What do you think our child will be like?" she asked, settling more comfortably against Kieran's warmth. "Stubborn," he said immediately, making her laugh. "With your determination and my strategic mind, powerful enough to make enemies think twice about challenging our family, wise enough to know when mercy is stronger than conquest." "Beautiful," she added, "with your strength and my magic. someone who will never doubt their own worth, because they'll be raised to understand that true power comes from knowing exactly who you are. A child who will grow up hearing stories about how their mother rose from servant to queen through courage and love, Kieran said, pressing a kiss to her temple, and how their father waited 8 centuries for the right woman to build a dynasty with. Lyra closed her eyes, imagining their child's future. A son or daughter who would learn to command winter storms before they could properly walk. An heir who would negotiate with neighbouring kingdoms from a position of absolute magical superiority. A ruler who would never know what it felt like to be dismissed or overlooked, or told they were less than they were. The bloodline would continue, the winter court would flourish, and somewhere in the future their descendants would look back at this moment as the beginning of a golden age that reshaped the very meaning of power in their world. "I love you," she said, the words carrying weight beyond simple affection. They were acknowledgement, promise, and declaration of intent, all wrapped into 3 simple syllables. "And I love you, my fierce winter queen," he replied, his arm tightening around her as though he could protect her from every possible future threat through sheer determination. "Both of you." The snow began to fall more heavily, responding to her joy with patterns of crystalline beauty that looked like celebration made visible. Below them, the kingdom settled into the peaceful rhythm of a land ruled by someone who understood that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to build something worth protecting. 6 months ago, Lyra had been nobody. Today she was everything. Morning light filtered through crystalline windows, painting the royal bedchamber in shades of silver and rose gold. Lyra woke slowly, emerging from dreams of snow-covered forests and children with ice-blue eyes, to find herself wrapped in the familiar warmth of Kieran's arms. His breathing was deep and even against her hair, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. 6 months of marriage had made this morning ritual as natural as breathing, this moment of peaceful awakening before the demands of ruling a kingdom called them back to duty. But today felt different. Today the future she carried within her made every sensation more vivid, more precious. She shifted carefully, not wanting to wake him yet, and placed her free hand over the subtle curve of her stomach where their child grew. Still early enough that only the most perceptive would notice the change, but already she could feel the potential power building there. Winter magic mixed with shapeshifter strength, royal authority combined with primal force. Their child would never know what it felt like to be powerless. "Good morning, my love," Kieran's voice rumbled against her ear, rough with sleep and contentment. "How are you feeling?" "Perfect," she replied, and meant it completely. "Though I think our little heir is going to be an early riser. I can feel them stirring already." His hand joined hers against her stomach, large and protective and gentle. "Strong," he murmured, wonder still colouring his voice despite having had the entire night to process the news. "I can sense their potential even now. This child will reshape the world." "They'll have that choice," Lyra corrected softly. "Power without choice is just another kind of prison. I want them to grow up knowing they can be anything they want to be, not just what others expect from their bloodline." Kieran's smile was visible in his voice. "Spoken like someone who knows exactly what it's like to have others define your worth for you." They lay in comfortable silence, watching dust motes dance in the morning light while their hands remained joined over the promise of their future. Through the windows, Lyra could see her kingdom waking, servants beginning their daily routines, guards changing shifts, early merchants setting up in the market squares that had become centres of prosperity under her rule. "Do you remember when you said I couldn't survive the bloodline test?" she asked, turning in his arms to face him properly. "I was wrong about many things in those days," he replied, golden eyes holding depths of love that still took her breath away. "I thought you needed protecting. I thought your power was something fragile that required careful handling. I thought the bond between us was about saving you from a world that wanted to destroy you. And now? Now I know that you were never meant to be saved," he said, brushing silver hair away from her face with infinite tenderness. You were meant to save yourself, become yourself, claim everything that was always rightfully yours. The bond between us isn't about protection. It's about partnership between equals who chose each other across impossible odds. Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude that came with being truly known by someone who loved every facet of what she had become. "I am no longer the servant girl who scrubbed floors," she said, echoing words she had spoken months ago, but which carried new weight now. "I am no longer the broken thing that everyone dismissed and ignored. I am Queen Lyra Lee of the Winter Court, and I am exactly who I was always meant to be." "And I am no longer the cursed beast of the north," he replied, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I am Kieran, your chosen king, father of your children, partner in building something better than either of us could have created alone." She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promises about all the mornings they would wake like this. When they broke apart, both smiling, she felt their child respond with a flutter of movement that made them both catch their breath. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "Both of you, all of us, this family we're building, this kingdom we're ruling, this future we're creating together." "And I love you, my impossible queen," he replied. "My fierce winter storm who became the centre of everything I never dared hope for." They rose together and moved to the wide windows that overlooked their realm, standing with arms wrapped around each other as they watched the northern kingdom come alive under gentle snowfall that sparkled like scattered diamonds. In the distance, Lyra could see the training grounds where young nobles would soon begin learning to channel their gifts, the council chambers where important decisions would be made, the market squares where prosperity flowed like water, her kingdom, her husband, her child growing within her, her power that had transformed from hidden burden into magnificent strength. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real," she admitted, ice crystals forming lazy patterns in the air around them as her magic responded to emotional contentment. "That I went from being invisible to being this. When I stopped believing I was worthless, everything else became possible," Kieran said, and she heard the echo of her own journey in his words. "When I stopped accepting other people's definitions of what I could be, I became who I was always meant to be." Lyra placed her hand on the window, and frost spread in delicate patterns across the glass. Not the chaotic ice of power unleashed in anger or fear, but the controlled artistry of magic wielded with perfect confidence. Beautiful designs that looked almost like writing in an ancient language, telling the story of a servant who became a queen, a curse that became a blessing, a kingdom that found its true rulers against all odds. "Our child will grow up in a world where power is used to protect rather than dominate," she said, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from having rebuilt her entire understanding of what strength really meant. "Where being different makes you valuable instead of expendable, where everyone has the chance to become exactly who they're meant to be." "A better world," Kieran agreed, his arm tightening around her as though he could hold on to this perfect moment forever. "Built by people who understand what it costs to be powerless and who choose to use their strength to ensure others never have to pay that price." The morning sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered kingdom in shades of gold and silver that seemed to celebrate the promise of everything yet to come. Below them, their subjects went about their daily lives in peace and prosperity, protected by rulers who had learned through suffering what true leadership really meant. In months to come, their child would be born amid celebration that would echo across kingdoms. The Winter Court bloodline would continue into a future bright with possibility. The Northern Kingdom would flourish under joint rule that balanced wisdom with strength, compassion with authority. But for now, in this quiet morning moment, Queen Lyra Lee and King Kieran simply stood together at their window, watching their kingdom wake while their unborn child stirred with the promise of magic that would one day reshape the very foundations of their world. Sometimes what the world calls worthless is simply waiting for the right moment to show its true value. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let others define who you are meant to be. The great hall had never felt so vast or so suffocating at the same time. Hundreds of bodies filled the ceremonial space, their combined presence creating a symphony of whispered conversations, rustling silk, and barely contained supernatural energy. Lyra moved along the perimeter like a ghost, silver wine pitcher clutched in her trembling hands, trying to make herself smaller than the shadows cast by the massive stone columns. The claiming ceremony had begun at sunset, and now the hall glowed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing off polished marble and the jewellery adorning the unmated females who stood in the centre of the room like offerings on an altar. Lady Seraphina commanded attention from the very heart of the display. Golden hair cascaded down her back in perfect waves, catching the candlelight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. Her dress was the colour of fresh blood, cut to emphasise every curve of her perfect form. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the world would bend to accommodate her beauty, her power, her undeniable worth. She was everything Lyra was not. "Magnificent, isn't she?" someone whispered near the wine table, and Lyra carefully didn't look up as she refilled goblets. "The southern kingdom's finest offering. They say her wolf form is pure gold, like liquid sunlight." "Perfect match for an alpha of suitable station," another voice agreed. "Political alliance aside, can you imagine the strength of their offspring?" Lyra's chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. Not jealousy exactly. She had never been foolish enough to imagine herself in Lady Seraphina's position, but something deeper, more primal, recoiled at the idea of that golden perfection being chosen by any of the powerful alphas who prowled the edges of the ceremony. The feeling made no sense. She dismissed it as another sign of her fundamental brokenness. Then the temperature in the hall dropped 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. Conversations died mid-sentence. The candle flames flickered in unison, bending toward the massive doors at the far end of the hall as though pulled by invisible strings. Even Lady Seraphina's perfect composure wavered, her golden eyes darting toward the entrance with something that might have been uncertainty. Lyra felt it before she saw him, a presence so ancient and powerful that it made her bones ache, made her suppressed wolf stir in its magical prison for the first time in years. The silver pitcher slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, but she caught it before it could crash to the floor, her enhanced reflexes surprising her. The beast of the north had arrived. He filled the doorway like a force of nature, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that spoke of barely leashed violence. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, falling to his shoulders in waves that suggested he cared nothing for the opinions of civilized society. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Lyra's lungs, ancient gold, like molten metal heated in dragonfire. He moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of a predator, and the assembled nobles parted before him like wheat before a scythe. Some dropped their gazes in submission. Others watched him with the kind of fascination reserved for beautiful, deadly things. All of them feared him. Lyra understood why. Power rolled off him in waves that made the air itself seem thicker, charged with the electricity that preceded violent storms. He was older than anyone in the room, had lived through centuries that the rest of them could only imagine. His wolf was legendary, a creature of shadow and ice that could kill with a single snap of jaws, larger than any natural beast. She tried to shrink further into the shadows along the wall, but something was wrong with her body. Her feet had stopped moving, her breathing had gone shallow and quick. The suppressed wolf inside her chest was clawing at its magical bindings, desperate to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be known. Then his head turned. Time stopped. Golden eyes met silver across the length of the great hall, and the world narrowed to that single moment of impossible recognition. Lyra felt something snap into place inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting centuries to be opened. Heat flooded her body, despite the supernatural cold that surrounded him, and she gasped at the intensity of it. He went perfectly still. Not the stillness of a man trying to control himself, but the absolute motionlessness of a predator who had just caught the scent of something that belonged to him. His nostrils flared slightly, and she watched his pupils dilate as whatever he sensed confirmed something that should have been impossible. The crowd noticed his sudden attention. Hundreds of eyes followed his gaze across the hall, landing on the servant girl pressed against the wall with her silver pitcher and her panicked expression. Whispers started like wildfire, spreading through the assembled nobles with the speed of scandal. What is he looking at? The servant? Impossible. Lady Seraphina's perfect features twisted with confusion, and the first hint of real anger she had ever been forced to display in public. Her golden eyes tracked from the Beast King to Lyra, and back again, and something cold and calculating settled in her expression. But Lyra saw none of it. She was drowning in the connection that had locked her gaze to his, feeling her suppressed wolf tear at its magical chains with new desperation. Pain lanced through her chest as power she didn't understand fought against bindings she couldn't see, and she pressed her free hand to her heart as though she could hold herself together through will alone. He took a step toward her. The crowd held its collective breath. This wasn't how the ceremony was supposed to proceed. The Beast King was meant to survey the unmated females presented for his consideration, to choose from among the worthy candidates who had been prepared for this moment their entire lives. He wasn't supposed to fixate on the wolfless servant who served wine to her betters. Another step, then another. The crowd parted before him as he crossed the hall with purposeful strides, never breaking eye contact with the girl who couldn't look away. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, and frost began forming on the silver pitcher in her hands without her notice. When he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin despite the supernatural cold that followed him everywhere, she realized she had forgotten how to breathe. He was even more overwhelming up close, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, built like a warrior who had spent centuries earning his reputation through violence and victory. The scent of winter storms and old magic clung to him, making her suppressed wolf whine with recognition and longing. "What is your name?" His voice was deep and rough, like whiskey aged in oak and smoke. "Lyra." The word escaped her lips without permission, barely more than a whisper. He nodded once, as though her answer confirmed something he had already known. Then he reached out with one large hand and brushed his fingertips against her cheek with shocking gentleness. The touch sent lightning through her entire body. "Mine," he said, and though he spoke quietly, the word carried to every corner of the silent hall. The silver pitcher slipped from Lyra's numb fingers and crashed to the marble floor, wine spreading like spilled blood across the stone. But she barely noticed. She was too busy trying to understand what had just happened, why the most powerful man in the kingdom was looking at her like she was something precious instead of something to be discarded. The crowd erupted into chaos, gasps and shouts and the rustle of fabric as people turned to their neighbours in disbelief. Lady Seraphina's perfect composure finally cracked completely, her face twisting with rage and humiliation. But through it all, the Beast King never took his eyes off Lyra's face, and deep in her chest, her suppressed wolf finally began to wake. The silence that followed his declaration stretched like a held breath before shattering into chaos. Lyra stood frozen as the Beast King's claim echoed through the great hall, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The word "mine" reverberated in her chest like a bell struck too hard, and she felt something deep inside her respond with desperate recognition. Her suppressed wolf pressed against its magical bindings with newfound strength, clawing toward a surface it had never been allowed to reach. The crowd erupted around them, gasps of shock, whispered conversations that grew louder by the second, the rustle of silk and satin as nobles turned to stare at the impossible scene unfolding before them. Some looked horrified, others fascinated. All of them understood they were witnessing something that defied every law of their carefully structured world. But Lyra saw none of it. She was drowning in the intensity of golden eyes that held her captive, feeling heat flood her body despite the supernatural cold that emanated from the man before her. This close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of centuries lived, could smell winter storms and ancient magic that made her wolf whine with longing. "This is impossible," she whispered, the words barely audible above the growing commotion. "Many things are impossible until they happen," he replied, and his voice held a warmth that hadn't been there when he'd spoken to the crowd. It was meant for her alone, intimate and sure. "What do you feel, little wolf?" Before she could answer, before she could even begin to understand what he was asking, another voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "A servant cannot be queen." Lady Seraphina's words rang with authority and barely controlled rage. The golden beauty had stepped forward from the group of unmated females, her perfect features twisted with something ugly and dangerous. Her power rolled off her in waves that made lesser wolves step back instinctively, but it was nothing compared to the ancient force that surrounded the Beast King. "The bloodline tests will expose the lie," Seraphina continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent hall. "No servant carries royal blood. When she fails the testing, this farce will end, and proper order will be restored." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled nobles. The bloodline tests were sacred law, older than memory, designed to prevent exactly this kind of disruption to the natural hierarchy. Only those with royal heritage could survive the magical trial that would bind them to the ancient crown, and everyone knew that servants were the furthest thing from royalty. Everyone except the Beast King, who still hadn't taken his eyes off Lyra's face. "You would require the bloodline test." His question was directed at the crowd, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. There was no anger in his voice, only a kind of patient inevitability that made Lyra's skin prickle with unease. "It is our right," called one of the council members from the edge of the crowd. "Sacred law demands proof of worthiness before any can claim the crown matrimonial. No exceptions, even for you, my lord." The Beast King nodded once, as though he had expected nothing less. Then his attention returned to Lyra, and she felt the world narrow to just the two of them again. When he spoke, his words were meant for her alone. "Are you prepared to die for this?" he asked quietly, and the question hit her like a physical blow. Die. The bloodline tests killed those unworthy to wear the crown. She had heard the stories whispered in servants' quarters, tales of failed claimants whose bodies couldn't withstand the magical fire that tested their heritage. Their screams as royal magic burned them from the inside out, their ashes scattered to the wind as a warning to others who might reach above their station. Terror flooded her system, but underneath it something else stirred. The same defiance that had kept her alive through 22 years of cruelty, the stubborn core of self that had refused to break no matter how many times she'd been told she was nothing. "I don't understand what's happening," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I don't understand why you chose me or what any of this means, but I'm tired of being afraid." Something flashed in his golden eyes, pride, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who had learned to survive in a world that wanted to destroy them. 3 days, he announced, turning to address the crowd without releasing her from his gaze. "She will undergo the bloodline testing in 3 days' time. If she survives, she will be prepared for the binding ceremony. If she does not—" He left the sentence hanging, but everyone understood the implication. If she didn't survive, there would be nothing left of her to mourn. The crowd shifted restlessly, some nobles looking satisfied that proper order would be maintained, others appearing uncomfortable with the idea of watching a servant girl burn alive for the crime of being chosen by their king. Lady Seraphina's expression had settled into cold calculation, as though she were already planning for the inevitable moment when Lyra's ashes would clear the way for a more suitable match. "Until then," the Beast King continued, his voice carrying absolute authority, "she will be housed in the tower quarters and given everything she requires. Anyone who harms her or interferes with her preparation will answer to me personally." The threat in those words was unmistakable. Lyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with his supernatural cold as she realized the kind of protection he was offering. The Beast of the North didn't make idle warnings, and his justice was swift and brutal. But protection wouldn't save her from the bloodline tests. Nothing could if she truly was what everyone believed her to be. A servant, worthless, born to scrub floors and serve wine to her betters. As if sensing her spiralling thoughts, his hand found hers. The contact sent electricity up her arm, and she gasped at the intensity of it. Through their joined hands, she felt an echo of his certainty, his absolute conviction that she was exactly where she belonged. "Trust me," he murmured, and though the words were spoken quietly enough that only she could hear them, they carried the weight of an oath. Before she could respond, before she could ask the 1,000 questions crowding her throat, 2 palace guards stepped forward. Their faces were carefully neutral, but she could see the confusion in their eyes as they prepared to escort a servant to quarters meant for royalty. "My lord," one of them said carefully, "shall we take her to the tower now?" The Beast King's thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made her chest ache. Then he released her hand and stepped back, the loss of contact leaving her feeling cold and untethered. "Take her," he said. "See that she has everything she needs." As the guards moved to flank her, Lyra looked back at him one last time. He stood motionless in the centre of the chaos, golden eyes tracking her movement like a predator watching prey. But there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like worry. "My lord," she called out, surprising herself with her boldness. "What if they're right? What if I am just a servant?" The question hung in the air between them, and she saw several emotions flicker across his ancient features. When he finally answered, his words carried to every corner of the silent hall. "Then I have waited 800 years for nothing," he said, "but I don't believe that's possible." The guards led her away through corridors she had never been allowed to enter, past tapestries and artwork that cost more than she had ever seen. But Lyra barely noticed the luxury surrounding her. She was too busy trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how her life had gone, from scrubbing floors to facing a test that would either crown her queen or kill her in the attempt. Behind them, the great hall remained frozen in shocked silence. Lady Seraphina stood among the unmated females like a golden statue, her perfect features carved from ice and rage. The Beast King had not moved from where Lyra had left him, and his eyes followed her until she disappeared around a corner. 3 days. In 3 days she would either be dead or discover that everything she had been told about herself was a lie. Deep in her chest, her suppressed wolf stirred with anticipation, as though it knew something she didn't, as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment to finally break free. The tower quarters were a revelation in luxury that Lyra had never imagined could exist. Silk curtains in deep emerald hung from windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the kingdom that she had never been privileged to see. The bed was large enough to sleep 6 people, draped in furs and linens so soft they felt like touching clouds. A fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across tapestries that depicted scenes of winter courts and ancient magic. Lyra stood in the centre of it all, afraid to touch anything, afraid her servant's hands might soil something so beautiful. "The Beast King ordered that you be given everything you need," the younger guard had said, before closing the heavy oak door behind her. "Someone will bring food shortly." Everything she needed, as though she had any idea what that might be, beyond the basic requirements of not starving or freezing to death. She moved carefully to the window, drawn by the sight of the kingdom spread out below her. From this height she could see the training grounds where pack warriors practiced their combat forms, the market squares where common folk went about their daily business, the distant forests that marked the boundaries of the Northern Kingdom's territory. It was beautiful and vast and completely foreign to someone who had spent her life in kitchens and servants' quarters. A soft knock interrupted her wonder. "Come in," she called, her voice sounding strange in the spacious room. A girl about her own age entered, carrying a tray laden with food that smelled better than anything Lyra had ever encountered. She was pretty in a quiet way, with brown hair braided back and kind eyes that held no judgment. "I'm Elena," she said, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. "I've been assigned to help you prepare for whatever comes next." Lyra detected the careful hesitation in Elena's voice and understood. Even the servants weren't sure what to make of a scullery maid being elevated to potential queen. The very idea violated everything they understood about how the world worked. "You don't have to pretend this isn't strange," Lyra said, moving away from the window. "I know what everyone is thinking." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "It is strange," she admitted, "but not necessarily wrong. The Beast King hasn't left his study since the ceremony ended, hasn't eaten either, according to the kitchen staff." Something twisted in Lyra's chest at those words. Pain, but not her own. An ache that felt like hunger, but deeper, more desperate. She pressed her hand to her heart, confused by the foreign sensation. "What do you mean?" she asked. "The bond," Elena said softly, as though speaking of something sacred. "Even I can feel the pull between you two, and I'm just human. They say when true mates are separated, it causes physical pain. The longer the separation, the worse it gets." Bond. The word echoed in Lyra's mind, carrying weight she didn't understand. She had heard whispers of such things in the servants' quarters, stories of destined pairs who were drawn together by forces older than civilization itself. But those were tales told about alphas and their chosen females, not about broken servants who couldn't even shift. "I don't understand any of this," Lyra whispered. "Why me? I'm nobody. I'm nothing." Elena studied her with surprisingly perceptive eyes. "Maybe that's exactly why," she said. "Maybe being nobody is what makes you somebody." Before Lyra could ask what that meant, another knock echoed through the chamber. This one was different, heavier, more certain. "Come in," Lyra called, though her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. The door opened to reveal the Beast King himself, and the air in the room immediately changed. The fire in the hearth flickered toward him as though drawn by magnetic force, and Elena dropped into a curtsy so deep she nearly touched the floor. "Leave us," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made disobedience impossible. Elena scurried out without another word, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Suddenly the spacious room felt intimate, charged with an energy that made Lyra's skin tingle. She could feel her suppressed wolf pressing against its bindings again, responding to his presence with desperate recognition. He looked terrible. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Lines of exhaustion carved shadows beneath his golden eyes, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of barely controlled pain. His dark hair was dishevelled, as though he had been running his hands through it, and when he moved toward her, she could see the careful way he held himself. "You're hurting," she said, surprising herself with the observation. "The bond," he replied simply, confirming what Elena had suggested. "It grows stronger with proximity and recognition. Fighting it becomes difficult." "Then why fight it?" The question hung between them, and Lyra saw something flicker in his ancient features. Vulnerability, perhaps, or a weariness that came from carrying burdens for longer than anyone should have to bear them. "Because you will die in 2 days," he said, and the blunt honesty of it stole her breath. "The bloodline tests kill those who lack royal heritage. Their bodies cannot withstand the magical fire that binds worthy souls to the ancient crown, and I cannot be the reason you burn alive." "But you chose me," she whispered, "in front of everyone. You claimed me." "I had no choice." His voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. 800 years I have waited, and my beast recognized you the moment our eyes met. The bond snapped into place like destiny itself, and I felt whole for the first time in centuries. He moved closer, and she could smell winter storms and old magic clinging to his skin. When he reached out to touch her face, she didn't pull away. "But I will not watch you die, because fate played a cruel joke," he continued, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with heartbreaking gentleness. "I will find a way to break the bond before the testing. Free you from this burden you never asked for." "What if I don't want to be freed?" The words escaped before she could stop them, and she saw his eyes widen with shock. But it was true, she realized. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen something worth claiming. Someone had chosen her, had declared her his before the entire kingdom. The thought of losing that, of returning to invisibility and servitude, was more terrifying than any magical trial. Lyra. Her name was a prayer on his lips. "You don't understand what you're saying." "I understand that I'm tired of being nothing," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I understand that when you looked at me, I felt alive for the first time in 22 years. I understand that whatever this bond is, it's the only thing that has ever felt right in my entire existence." "And if you're wrong? If the testing kills you?" "Then at least I'll die as someone who mattered to somebody," she replied, "instead of living as someone who mattered to no one." The pain in his expression was almost unbearable. He pulled her against his chest then, holding her with desperate strength, and she felt his heart racing beneath her palm. The bond between them pulsed like a living thing, golden threads of connection that seemed to wind around her soul. "I have waited 800 years for you," he murmured into her hair. "I cannot lose you now." "Then don't," she whispered back. "Help me survive the testing. Help me become whatever I need to be." For a long moment they simply held each other in the firelit chamber, two souls bound by forces neither of them fully understood. Outside, the kingdom prepared for war if the bloodline tests failed. Lady Seraphina plotted her return to favour. The council debated the wisdom of allowing such dangerous disruption to the established order. But in the tower quarters, surrounded by luxury she had never imagined, Lyra felt something she had never experienced before. Hope. "The testing works by connecting the candidate to the ancient magic that built this kingdom," he said eventually, his voice muffled against her hair. "It searches for royal bloodline markers, traces of power that mark someone as worthy to rule. Without those markers—" "The magic burns them alive," she finished. "I understand." "But there are ways to prepare," he continued. "Rituals to strengthen the spirit, meditations to open pathways that may have been blocked. If you truly carry royal blood, even a trace, we might be able to awaken it before the testing." "And if I don't carry royal blood?" His arms tightened around her. "Then we face that truth when it comes." She pulled back to look at his face, seeing the ancient weariness there, the burden of centuries spent alone. But also seeing something else, determination, hope, the faint possibility that fate might not be as cruel as they feared. "Teach me," she said. "Whatever I need to learn, whatever I need to become, I'm ready." He studied her for a long moment, golden eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt or fear. When he found none, something shifted in his expression. The Beast King, ruler of the Northern Kingdom, bowed his head to the servant girl who might become his queen. "Then we begin tonight," he said, "and may the ancient powers have mercy on us both." The ancient oracle arrived at dawn, like a winter storm given human form. Lyra felt his presence before she saw him, a pressure in the air that made her suppressed wolf claw frantically at its magical bindings. She stood at the tower window, watching the sun paint the kingdom in shades of gold and rose, when the very atmosphere seemed to thicken with ancient power that was both familiar and terrifying. Elena burst through the chamber doors without ceremony, her usual composure shattered. "He's here," she gasped, pressing one hand to her chest as though she couldn't quite catch her breath. "The Oracle Matthias. He's demanding to see you before the council can interfere." The name sent ice through Lyra's veins. Oracle Matthias was legend made flesh, older than kingdoms, keeper of bloodline secrets that predated written history. His very existence was whispered about in fearful tones, and most believed him to be nothing more than myth designed to frighten children into obedience. But the power pressing against her consciousness was undeniably real. "The Beast King?" Lyra asked, though she wasn't sure why his presence would comfort her in the face of such overwhelming ancient force. "In council chambers, arguing with the nobles about the testing protocols," Elena replied. "He doesn't know the oracle has come." Before Lyra could respond, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Frost began forming on the windows, and the fire in the hearth guttered as though something had stolen its oxygen. Elena made a small sound of terror and backed toward the door. "Leave us, child." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating with the kind of authority that made mountains bow and rivers change course. "What comes next is not for mortal ears." Elena fled without another word, and Lyra found herself alone, with a presence that filled the chamber despite no visible form. The air shimmered near the fireplace, and slowly a figure began to materialize from shadow and starlight. Oracle Matthias was not what she had expected. Ancient, yes, with silver hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes the colour of winter ice. But he carried himself with the fluid grace of someone far younger, and when those impossible eyes fixed on her face, she felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. "So," he said, his voice now emanating from his physical form, though it had lost none of its supernatural resonance. "The lost princess finally awakens." "I'm not a princess," Lyra said automatically, though her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I'm a servant." Matthias tilted his head, studying her with the kind of intensity that suggested he was seeing far more than just her physical form. Magic radiated from him in waves that made her skin tingle and her suppressed wolf whine with recognition. "Are you?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Then tell me, little wolf, why does your power call to mind like the song of the Winter Court? Why does ancient royal magic recognize you as kin?" He raised one hand, and silver light began to pool in his palm. The light reached toward her like living tendrils, and when it touched her skin, Lyra gasped at the shock of connection. Images flooded her mind, snow-covered palaces, wolves with silver fur and ice-blue eyes, a woman who looked exactly like her older self placing a crown of winter stars on her head. "Impossible," she breathed, stumbling backward until her legs hit the bed. "The spell hiding your true nature is ancient and powerful," Matthias continued, the silver light still connecting them. "Cast by your mother as she lay dying, performed with the last of her strength to hide you from those who had murdered the rest of your family. The Winter Court royalty, thought extinct for over 2 decades. The visions intensified. A palace made of ice and starlight, a woman with silver hair teaching a small child to call snow from clear skies, blood on pristine white marble as attackers in dark cloaks cut down everyone she had ever known. "Stop!" Lyra gasped, pressing her hands to her temples as the memories threatened to overwhelm her. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "The suppression spell was designed to protect you," Matthias said, his voice gentling slightly. "But it was also slowly killing you. Power that strong, contained for so long, creates fractures in the soul. Without release, it would have consumed you from within before your 30th year." He moved closer, and she could feel the ancient magic that surrounded him like a living thing. When he reached out to touch her forehead, she didn't pull away. "May I?" he asked, and something in his tone suggested this was a request that could be refused. Lyra nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. The moment his fingers made contact with her skin, the world exploded into sensation. Power rushed through her like a dam bursting, and she felt the suppression spell crack under the pressure of her true nature fighting to break free. Her suppressed wolf didn't just stir, it roared with the voice of winter storms and ancient authority. The tower room filled with supernatural cold that turned her breath to mist. Frost spread across every surface in delicate patterns that looked almost like writing in a language older than civilization. The windows didn't just fog, they became canvases for ice art so intricate and beautiful that it looked like the work of master craftsmen. But the power surge was too much, too fast. Pain lanced through every nerve as magic fought against bindings that had held for over 2 decades. Lyra screamed, and the sound came out layered with harmonics that shattered 3 of the frosted windows. "Easy," Matthias murmured, his other hand moving to her shoulder. "The spell is breaking, but it must be done carefully. Too much at once will tear you apart." Through the pain and overwhelming sensation, Lyra felt him working, carefully unravelling threads of magic that had been woven into her very bones. With each loosened binding, more of her true nature flooded back. Memories of a childhood spent learning to command ice and snow. The feeling of shifting for the first time, her wolf form silver as moonlight with eyes like winter stars. The sound of her mother's voice teaching her the old songs that could call blizzards or gentle snowfall. "There," Matthias said finally, stepping back. "The first layer is broken. The rest must come gradually, or it will kill you." Lyra collapsed onto the bed, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and residual magic. But for the first time in her life, she felt complete. The constant ache she had carried without understanding was gone, replaced by a sense of wholeness that brought tears to her eyes. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember the palace, the lessons, my mother's face." "Princess Lyralee of the Winter Court," Matthias said formally, inclining his head in what could only be described as a bow. "Last surviving heir of the most ancient royal bloodline in the northern kingdoms." Before she could fully process what he had called her, angry voices echoed from the corridor outside. The door burst open to reveal the Beast King, his golden eyes wild with fury and concern. Behind him, several council members tried to push past, their faces flushed with outrage. "What have you done?" the Beast King demanded, his gaze taking in the frost-covered room and Lyra's collapsed form. "I felt her power surge from 3 floors away." "I have given her the truth," Matthias replied calmly, "and the first key to surviving your bloodline tests." "The first key?" Lady Seraphina's voice came from the doorway, where she stood behind the council members, with calculation glittering in her golden eyes. "Then you admit she required magical intervention to pass? That proves she's a fraud." Matthias turned those ancient ice-blue eyes on the golden beauty, and Lyra saw her take an involuntary step backward. "I admit that 23 years of suppression magic requires careful unravelling, Lady Seraphina. Tell me, would you survive having your power bound and hidden from birth? Would any of you?" "Suppression magic is forbidden," one of the council members declared. "If what you claim is true—" "Then someone very powerful wanted the Winter Court bloodline to remain hidden," Matthias interrupted. "The question you should be asking is why." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, but Lyra barely noticed. She was staring at her hands, watching frost patterns form and dissolve across her palms with just a thought. For the first time in her life, magic obeyed her will, instead of fighting against invisible barriers. "The testing is tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that made everyone in the room look at her with startled attention. "Will I be ready?" Matthias smiled, and the expression transformed his ancient features into something almost paternal. "My dear child, you were born ready. You just needed to remember who you are." But as Lyra looked around the room at the faces surrounding her, the Beast King's protective concern, Lady Seraphina's calculating rage, the Council's uncertain fear, she realized that remembering who she was had only made everything more dangerous. The Winter Court had been destroyed for a reason, and now that she had awakened, whoever had orchestrated that destruction 23 years ago would be coming for her. The bloodline testing was no longer just about proving her worthiness to rule. It was about staying alive long enough to uncover the truth behind her family's murder. Outside the tower windows, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, responding to her emotional turmoil. Lightning flickered within them, but instead of the usual yellow-white, it glowed silver-blue. Winter magic, ancient and powerful and finally free. And somewhere in the depths of the palace, enemies she didn't even know she had were preparing their next move. The night air tasted of poison and betrayal. Lyra had learned to trust her enhanced senses over the past day, the breaking of the suppression spell having sharpened every instinct she possessed. So when she lifted the delicate porcelain teacup that Elena had brought with the evening meal, the acrid scent that shouldn't have been there hit her like a physical blow. Nightshade, carefully masked with honey and mint, but unmistakable to someone whose blood carried the memory of 1,000 royal assassination attempts. The cup slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone floor in a spray of poisoned tea and ceramic shards. The liquid hissed where it touched the marble, eating tiny holes in the stone that confirmed her worst suspicions. Someone wanted her dead before she could reach the bloodline testing. "Elena," she called, her voice carrying new harmonics that made the windows rattle. The servant girl appeared in the doorway within seconds, her face pale with concern. "My lady, I heard something break—" Elena's words died as she saw the spreading stain on the floor, the way the marble bubbled and pitted where the tea had touched it. "Who brought this tray?" Lyra asked, her tone deadly quiet. I collected it from the kitchens, as always," Elena stammered, backing toward the door. "Cook Maren prepared it herself, said it was a special blend to help you sleep before tomorrow's testing." Lyra studied the girl's face, reading fear and confusion but no deception. Elena was innocent, merely the unwitting tool of whoever had orchestrated this attempt. But someone in the kitchens, someone with access to the foods meant for the tower quarters, was trying to ensure she never made it to the bloodline trials alive. The tower door burst open without ceremony, admitting a presence that made every nerve in Lyra's body sing with recognition. The Beast King filled the doorway, golden eyes blazing with barely controlled fury as he took in the scene before him. "I scented poison," he growled, and his voice carried undertones that belonged to something far more dangerous than human. "Someone dares—" "To kill me before I can prove my legitimacy," Lyra finished, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Yes, the question is who and how many others are involved." He was across the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside the spreading stain on the floor. When he inhaled, his expression went from fury to something far more deadly. "Nightshade, distilled and concentrated," he said, rising to his full height. In this concentration, it would have stopped your heart within minutes, made it look like the stress of tomorrow's testing had simply been too much for a servant girl to bear. "But I'm not a servant girl," Lyra said, and for the first time she truly meant it. "I'm Princess Lyralee of the Winter Court, and whoever did this has just declared war on the wrong bloodline." Something flashed in his golden eyes, pride perhaps, or recognition of the steel that was finally emerging from beneath years of imposed servitude. "Elena," he said without taking his gaze from Lyra's face, "summon the captain of the guard, tell him to secure the kitchens and bring me Cook Maren for questioning, and send for Oracle Matthias. If there are enemies moving within these walls, we need to know how deep the corruption runs." Elena curtsied and fled, leaving them alone in the frost-touched chamber. The Beast King moved closer, and Lyra felt the mate bond pulse between them like a living thing, warm and reassuring despite the chill that had settled over the room. "You saved yourself," he said quietly, reaching out to touch her cheek. "Your awakening senses detected what would have killed you." "The Winter Court blood remembers," Lyra replied, leaning into his touch despite everything. "Even after 23 years of suppression, it knows the smell of our enemies." "Our enemies," he repeated, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "You know something," she said. It wasn't a question. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might deny it. Then he sighed, the sound heavy with centuries of burden. "The Winter Court wasn't destroyed by random violence," he admitted. "It was a coordinated attack, planned and executed by someone with intimate knowledge of their defences. Someone who knew exactly when and where to strike for maximum devastation." "Who?" The word came out layered with winter wind and barely leashed power. "We never discovered the truth. By the time I arrived at the Winter Palace, everyone was dead except for one infant who had vanished without a trace. The attackers had covered their tracks well, and the few survivors from the outer settlements could only describe figures in dark cloaks who moved with supernatural speed and coordination." "But you suspect someone," Lyra pressed, reading the tension in his shoulders. "I suspect everyone," he said grimly. The Winter Court's fall removed the oldest and most powerful magical bloodline from the political landscape. Several kingdoms benefited from that power vacuum, including some who call themselves our allies today. Before she could respond, shouting erupted from the corridor outside. Not the organised commotion of guards following orders, but the chaotic sound of panic and violence. The Beast King was moving before the first scream finished echoing, positioning himself between Lyra and the door with predatory grace. The shouting grew closer, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of weapons clashing against weapons. Then Elena's voice, high and terrified. "No, please, I don't know anything, I was just—" Her words cut off in a gurgle that made Lyra's blood freeze. "Stay behind me!" the Beast King commanded, his form beginning to blur as his human shape prepared to give way to something far more dangerous. "Whatever happens, do not let them separate us." The tower door exploded inward, torn from its hinges by supernatural force. Through the smoking wreckage came figures in dark cloaks, their faces hidden, but their intent unmistakable. They moved with inhuman coordination, spreading out to surround the chamber with practiced efficiency. Assassins, the same ones who had destroyed the Winter Court, or their successors trained in identical methods. "Princess Lyralee," one of them said, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't identify. "You have caused us considerable inconvenience by surviving this long." "Not nearly as much inconvenience as I'm about to cause," she replied, and felt power rise within her like a tide of winter starlight. The Beast King's transformation completed between one heartbeat and the next. Where a man had stood, now crouched a wolf the size of a small horse, fur as black as midnight and eyes that glowed with golden fire. His growl reverberated through the stone walls, and several of the assassins took involuntary steps backward. "Kill them both," the leader commanded. "The bloodline ends tonight." They attacked as one, moving with supernatural speed that would have overwhelmed any normal opponent. But Lyra was no longer normal, and her mate was something far beyond human limitations. The Beast King launched himself at the nearest group of attackers with lethal grace, jaws closing around the throat of one assassin before the others could react. His claws raked through enhanced leather armour like it was silk, and his size allowed him to bowl over multiple opponents with each charge. But there were too many of them, and they had come prepared for supernatural resistance. One of the assassins produced a crossbow that gleamed with unnatural light, its bolts clearly designed to penetrate even shapeshifter hide. Another began chanting in a language that predated the kingdom, and Lyra felt bindings of dark magic reaching toward her like invisible chains. The spell touched her awakening power, and pain lanced through her skull as someone tried to force the suppression magic back into place, to make her helpless again, defenceless against their attack. That was their mistake. The Winter Court had been destroyed once through trickery and overwhelming numbers, but they had never faced a Winter Court heir whose power had been compressed and concentrated by decades of suppression, then suddenly released in the presence of her destined mate. Lyra opened herself to the magic that sang in her blood, and the tower chamber filled with supernatural winter. Not the gentle cold that had accompanied her earlier manifestations, but the brutal, killing cold of Arctic storms and mountain blizzards. Frost spread across every surface with explosive speed, and the assassin's weapons became too cold to hold as metal conducted temperature that could freeze flesh to bone. One of the attackers screamed as ice formed in his lungs. Another tried to retreat, but found himself rooted to the floor by ice that had frozen his feet to the stone. The leader's dark magic shattered against the wall of winter power that surrounded Lyra like armour made of starlight and snow. "Oh, impossible!" he gasped, his accent becoming more pronounced as panic overtook training. "The suppression spell was broken yesterday," Lyra said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the remaining assassins clutch their ears in pain. "Along with my patience for people who think I'm easy prey." She gestured, and ice erupted from the floor in sharp spears that pierced through two more attackers. The Beast King took advantage of their distraction to eliminate another pair, his massive jaws crushing enhanced armour and the flesh beneath with equal ease. In less than a minute, the tower chamber was filled with bodies and the scent of blood freezing on supernatural ice. The leader was the last one standing, and only because Lyra wanted answers before she killed him. "Who sent you?" she demanded, ice forming around his feet to hold him in place. You think this changes anything?" he gasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth where the cold had burst vessels in his throat. "The Winter Court dies tonight one way or another. If we have failed, others will not." "Others?" The Beast King had returned to human form, though his eyes still glowed with predatory light. "How many?" The assassin smiled, showing teeth stained with blood. "Enough. The testing will proceed tomorrow, but she will never live to claim the crown. We have contingencies." Before either of them could react, he bit down on something concealed in his mouth. Poison, quick-acting and fatal, judging by the way his body convulsed and went still within seconds. Lyra stared at the corpse, her mind racing. The assassination attempt tonight had been a diversion, she realised, a backup plan in case the poison tea failed. But the real threat wasn't here in the tower. It was waiting for her at tomorrow's bloodline testing. "They're going to attack during the ceremony," she said, ice still swirling around her in lazy patterns. "When I'm most vulnerable, when the ancient magic has me connected to the crown's power, that's when they'll strike." The Beast King nodded grimly. "Then we change the plan. Move the testing to a secure location, limit the number of witnesses." "No," Lyra interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "If we run, if we hide, they win. The kingdom sees weakness, and Lady Seraphina gets exactly what she wants. We proceed as planned." "You could die." "I could die anyway," she pointed out. "But this way, I'd die as a queen fighting for her throne, not as a frightened girl hiding in shadows." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant when his expression shifted from protective concern to something deeper. Recognition, respect, love for the woman she was becoming, rather than pity for what she had been. "Then we prepare for war," he said simply. "Yes," she agreed, looking around the chamber at the frozen corpses of their enemies. "We prepare for war." Outside the shattered windows, storm clouds gathered with supernatural speed, responding to her emotional turmoil. But this time, the lightning that flickered within them wasn't silver blue. It was pure white, the colour of winter starlight and royal Winter Court magic fully awakened. Tomorrow she would either claim her birthright or die trying. But tonight she was done being afraid. Dawn came like a blade across the northern kingdom, painting the ancient testing circle in shades of blood and gold. Lyra stood at the edge of the ceremonial grounds, watching hundreds of witnesses take their places in the stone amphitheatre that had been carved from living rock by the first Winter Court mages over a millennium ago. Every noble family, every pack leader, every person of importance in the Northern Kingdom had come to witness what they expected to be either her coronation or her execution. The betting, she had heard, heavily favoured execution. "The circle hasn't been activated in over 30 years, Oracle Matthias said quietly from beside her. "Not since the last disputed succession. The magic within those stones remembers every test, every success, every failure. It will know if your bloodline is true." "And if it's not?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then the ancient fire will consume you from within, and your ashes will join those of every other pretender who dared claim royal blood." His ice-blue eyes studied her face for any sign of doubt. "Are you prepared for that possibility?" Lyra looked down at her hands, where frost patterns formed and dissolved with each breath she took. Since Oracle Matthias had broken the first layer of her suppression spell, power had been building within her like pressure behind a dam. She could feel it pressing against the remaining bindings, desperate for release. "I've been preparing to die my entire life," she said. "Today is just the first time I get to choose how." The Beast King appeared at her other side, moving with the silent grace that marked him as something far more dangerous than human. He had barely left her presence since the assassination attempt, and she could feel his tension like a living thing through the mate bond that connected them. "The Council has agreed to the traditional protocols," he reported, his golden eyes scanning the assembled crowd for threats. "You will approach the circle alone, place your hands upon the northern crown while it rests on the heartstone, and allow the ancient magic to test your heritage. No weapons, no assistance, no intervention from any source." "Including you," Lyra said, reading the frustration in his voice. "Including me." His jaw tightened. "If you fail, if the magic begins to burn you, I am bound by sacred law not to interfere. To do so would invalidate any future testing and condemn you to be seen as false regardless of your true bloodline." She turned to face him fully, seeing the ancient anguish in his expression. 800 years he had waited for his mate, only to find her in circumstances that might force him to watch her die. "Then don't watch," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "If it comes to that, look away. Remember me as I am now, not as I might become." Lyra Lee. Her true name was a prayer on his lips. "It's time," Oracle Matthias announced, before the Beast King could say whatever words were building in his throat. The crowd had settled into expectant silence. Hundreds of faces turned toward the three figures standing at the edge of the testing circle. Lady Seraphina sat in the place of honour reserved for the highest-ranking unmated female, her golden hair catching the morning light like a crown itself. Her expression was composed, but Lyra could see the anticipation in her eyes. She was expecting to watch a servant girl burn alive and clear the path to her own queenship. Lyra walked toward the circle alone. The ancient stones rose from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants, each one carved with runes that predated written language. They formed a perfect circle 20 feet across, and at its centre sat the Heartstone, a chunk of crystallized winter magic the size of a throne, upon which rested the northern crown. The crown itself was a masterwork of ancient craftsmanship, wrought from silver that had never tarnished and set with gems that held captive starlight. But it was more than mere jewellery. It was a conduit for the kingdom's foundational magic, a test that would connect her soul to every drop of royal blood that had ever worn it. As Lyra stepped across the threshold into the circle, the runes on the stones began to glow with soft silver light. The crowd's murmur died completely, leaving only the sound of her footsteps on stone worn smooth by centuries of ceremony. The temperature dropped 10 degrees with each step she took toward the centre. By the time she reached the Heartstone, her breath was misting in air that had become arctic. The Northern Crown sat before her like a challenge, beautiful and deadly and absolutely still, waiting. "Princess Lyra Lee of the Winter Court," Oracle Matthias called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheatre. "Place your hands upon the crown and let the ancient magic judge your claim." She looked out at the sea of faces watching her, some curious, some fearful, some hungry for the spectacle they expected to witness. Her gaze found the Beast King's golden eyes and held them for one precious moment, drawing strength from the bond that connected them across the space between. Then she placed her palms on either side of the Northern Crown. The world exploded into sensation. Magic older than kingdoms flooded through her, seeking every corner of her soul with relentless intensity. It felt like being struck by lightning made of starlight, like having molten silver poured through her veins. The ancient power searched for royal bloodline markers, traces of the magic that had built this kingdom, stone by stone, and found them. But the suppression spell that Oracle Matthias had only partially broken fought back with desperate strength. Magic that had been woven into her bones from infancy tried to hide what the testing fire sought to reveal, creating a conflict within her very essence that threatened to tear her apart. Pain lanced through every nerve as power warred against bindings, and Lyra screamed with a voice that carried harmonics of winter wind and ancient authority. The sound shattered 3 of the crystal formations that decorated the amphitheatre's upper reaches, and several witnesses pressed their hands to their ears in reflexive protection. The remaining suppression magic cracked under the pressure. Ice erupted from the ground around the circle in jagged spears that rose 30 feet into the morning air. Frost spread across every surface with explosive speed, turning the ancient stones into sculptures of crystallized winter. The temperature plummeted so quickly that the breath of every witness became visible clouds of vapor. But still the testing fire burned within her, demanding proof of heritage, and still the suppression spell fought to hide her true nature. "Let go!" Oracle Matthias called out, his voice somehow carrying over the supernatural storm that had engulfed the testing circle. "Stop fighting what you are, and let the Winter Court magic answer the call." Lyra heard him through the agony that filled her body, understood what he was asking. The suppression spell would only break completely if she stopped helping it contain her power, stopped trying to remain small and invisible and safe. She had to choose to be a queen. With effort that felt like tearing her own soul in half, Lyra stopped fighting against the magic within her and opened herself completely to what she had always been meant to be. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The remaining suppression spell didn't just break, it exploded. Power that had been compressed and hidden for 23 years erupted from her in waves that turned the testing circle into the heart of a supernatural blizzard. Snow began falling from clear skies, each flake glowing with silver light that had never touched mortal weather. The Northern Crown responded to the flood of Winter Court magic by blazing with light so intense it was visible even through the storm. Ancient runes carved into its surface came alive, pulsing with recognition as royal blood called to royal heritage across the centuries. Lyra felt the crown's magic wrap around her awakening power like an embrace from every Winter Court ruler who had ever lived. Their strength flowed into her, their knowledge and wisdom and fierce protective love for the kingdom they had built. She was no longer just Lyra, the servant girl who scrubbed floors. She was Princess Lyra Lee, heir to the Winter Court, rightful queen of the Northern Kingdom by blood and magic and sacred right. The crowd's gasps were audible even over the wind as she lifted the Northern Crown from the Heartstone with hands that glowed with silver fire. The moment she placed it on her head, the supernatural storm reached its peak. Lightning flickered within the snow clouds, not the yellow-white of natural storms, but the pure silver-blue of Winter Court magic fully awakened. Each bolt struck the ground around the testing circle, leaving behind patterns of ice so intricate they looked like writing in an ancient language. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm stopped. The snow continued to fall, but gently now, each flake settling on the amphitheatre like a blessing. The temperature rose to merely cold instead of killing, though frost patterns still decorated every surface in delicate beauty. And in the centre of the testing circle stood a figure that made every witness hold their breath. Lyra's servant's clothes had been transformed by the magical awakening, replaced by a gown of winter starlight that seemed to be cut from captured aurora. Her silver hair moved with currents of power that had nothing to do with wind, and her eyes held depths of ice-blue magic that reflected centuries of royal authority. She looked like what she was, a winter court queen in her full power. The silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. Then Oracle Matthias's voice rang out across the amphitheatre, formal and carrying absolute certainty. "The bloodline is true. The testing is complete. All hail Queen Lyrily of the Winter Court, rightful ruler of the Northern Kingdom." Some of the witnesses knelt immediately, recognising legitimate royal authority when confronted with it. Others remained standing, too stunned to move. A few looked toward Lady Seraphina, clearly uncertain which way political currents would flow. But Lady Seraphina herself was no longer looking confident. Her perfect features had gone pale, and her golden eyes held something that might have been the first real fear she had ever experienced, because she understood, as everyone in the amphitheatre now understood, that the servant girl was gone forever. In her place stood a queen whose bloodline predated kingdoms, whose power could reshape the very weather, whose authority was written in magic older than memory itself. And that queen was looking directly at her with ice-blue eyes that promised a reckoning for every cruel word, every dismissal, every moment of deliberate humiliation. The real battle was just beginning. "The crown acknowledges me," Lyra said, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in the bones of everyone who heard it. "Does anyone dare challenge my claim?" Lady Seraphina rose from her seat like a golden flame, her own power finally showing itself as her eyes blazed with supernatural light. When she spoke, her words rang with the authority of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. "I challenge the right of a servant-born pretender to rule over true nobility," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheatre. "Royal blood or not, she lacks the strength to lead this kingdom. I demand trial by combat for the right to be queen." The crowd erupted into chaos at the formal challenge, but Lyra barely noticed. She was too busy staring at Lady Seraphina with new understanding, seeing patterns of power and ambition that she had missed before. This wasn't just about wounded pride or political disappointment. This was about someone who had been planning to claim the throne long before the Beast King had ever chosen a mate, and now that plan was finally being revealed. The hours between the bloodline testing and the evening's combat trial passed like a blur of steel and starlight. Lyra stood in the centre of the palace's private training grounds, her newly awakened power flowing around her in visible currents of silver-blue magic. The winter court gown had been replaced by practical fighting leathers, but the crown remained on her head, a symbol of what she had won and what she now had to defend. "Your ice magic responds to emotion," Oracle Matthias explained, watching as frost spread across the stone floor with each surge of her anger. "But in combat, emotion can be a liability as much as a strength. Lady Seraphina will try to provoke you into losing control." The Beast King circled the training space like a caged predator, his golden eyes tracking every movement as Lyra practiced channeling her power into specific forms. Ice spears that could pierce armour, frozen barriers that could deflect magical attacks, patches of supernatural cold that could freeze an opponent's feet to the ground. "She's stronger than she appeared," he said, his voice tight with concern. "During her challenge, I caught her scent properly for the first time. She's been masking her true power level with magic. What we saw at the ceremony was maybe half of what she's capable of." "Then why hide it?" Lyra asked, sending a cascade of ice shards toward a practice target with deadly precision. Because she's been planning this for longer than we realized, Oracle Matthias replied grimly. Someone doesn't develop that kind of power concealment without extensive training. This challenge isn't opportunistic. It's been years in the making. Lyra paused in her practice, ice crystals still swirling around her like protective armor. The implications of what they were suggesting settled in her mind like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. "The Winter Court massacre," she said slowly. "You think she was involved?" "I think someone has been positioning themselves to claim the Northern Kingdom's throne since before you were born," the Beast King said. "And I think they've been very, very patient." A new voice cut across the training ground, cultured and carrying just enough mockery to set Lyra's teeth on edge. How fascinating to hear the great Beast King speculating about conspiracies. They turned to see Lady Seraphina approaching with a retinue of Southern Kingdom guards, her golden hair catching the afternoon light like spun metal. She had changed from her ceremonial dress into combat gear that looked both beautiful and deadly, golden armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal, weapons that hummed with enhancement magic. "The combat trial doesn't begin until sunset," Oracle Matthias said, his ancient authority making the air itself feel heavier. "You have no business here." "Oh, but I do," Seraphina replied, her smile sharp as a blade. "I came to offer our newly crowned queen some friendly advice before she dies tonight." The temperature around Lyra dropped 10 degrees in response to the threat, frost forming intricate patterns on her armor. "I'm listening," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made several of Seraphina's guards step backward instinctively. "Surrender the crown now, and I'll make your death quick," Seraphina continued, apparently unbothered by the supernatural cold. "Refuse, and I'll ensure you suffer before the end. The choice is yours." "Here's a counter-offer," Lyra replied, ice beginning to form in the air around her hands. "Withdraw your challenge, leave the Northern Kingdom, and never return. Because if you face me in that arena tonight, I will show you exactly why the Winter Court was feared by every kingdom that ever tried to conquer them." Something flickered in Seraphina's golden eyes. Not fear exactly, but a calculation that suggested she was reassessing the threat level of her opponent. "We shall see," she said finally. "Though I wonder if your precious mate will still want you when you're nothing but ashes on the arena floor." The Beast King's growl was audible even in human form, and the air around him began to shimmer with barely contained power. But before he could respond, before any of them could move, Seraphina played her final card. "Did you tell her, Oracle?" she asked, turning those calculating eyes on Matthias. "Did you tell your little princess who really killed her family?" The silence that followed was deafening. Oracle Matthias had gone perfectly still, his ancient features carved from ice and regret. The Beast King's expression shifted from protective fury to something darker, more complex, and Lyra felt the bottom drop out of her world as she understood that there were still secrets being kept from her. "What is she talking about?" Lyra asked quietly, though her voice carried enough power to crack the stone beneath their feet. "The Winter Court massacre wasn't random violence," Seraphina continued, clearly enjoying the chaos she was sowing. "It was a coordinated strike designed to eliminate a bloodline that threatened certain political arrangements that benefited multiple kingdoms, including this one." "That's enough," Oracle Matthias said, but his words lacked their usual authority. "Is it?" Seraphina's smile widened. "Tell me, Princess, did you ever wonder why the Beast King arrived at your palace so quickly after the attack, almost as though he knew it was going to happen?" The ice around Lyra's hands began to spread, creeping across the training ground in jagged patterns that reflected her emotional turmoil. She looked at the Beast King, searching his face for denial, for reassurance, for anything that would contradict what Seraphina was implying. Instead, she saw guilt written in every line of his ancient features. "You knew," she whispered, and the words came out layered with winter wind and betrayal. "You knew they were going to attack my family." "I suspected," he said, and his voice was rough with centuries of regret. There were rumours, political movements suggesting that certain kingdoms wanted the Winter Court removed from power, but I had no proof, no specific intelligence about timing or methods. And you did nothing? I sent warnings, I offered military support. Your mother refused, said the Winter Court could defend itself. His golden eyes held anguish that looked genuine, but Lyra was no longer sure she could trust her own judgment. When I arrived and found the palace in ruins, found everyone dead except for one missing infant, I searched for years trying to find you. How convenient that you stopped searching just long enough for me to grow up serving in your own kitchens, Lyra said, ice now spreading in a circle around her feet. I never stopped searching, he insisted, but the suppression spell hid you completely. Even standing in the same room with you for years, I couldn't sense what you truly were until the moment our eyes met at the ceremony. Seraphina laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. What a touching story. Too bad it's only half true. Meaning? Lyra's voice had gone deadly quiet. Meaning your precious mate wasn't just suspicious about the attack, Seraphina said. He was invited to participate. The Northern Kingdom was offered a significant portion of Winter Court territory in exchange for looking the other way while certain problems were eliminated. That's a lie, the Beast King snarled, his form beginning to blur as his control slipped. Is it? Then why don't you tell her about the treaty you signed 3 days before the massacre? The one that would have granted you mining rights to Winter Court crystal caves in exchange for non-interference in Southern Kingdom affairs. The world seemed to tilt around Lyra as she stared at the man who had claimed to be her destined mate, seeing him through new eyes. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had allowed herself to believe, suddenly felt like carefully constructed lies. The treaty existed, Oracle Matthias said heavily, finally breaking his silence. But it was never implemented. When the Winter Court fell, he burned the document rather than claim the territorial gains. Because he felt guilty, Seraphina pressed, because he realised too late that his political manoeuvring had contributed to the genocide of an entire royal bloodline. Enough, Lyra said, and her voice carried such power that ice erupted from the ground in a perfect circle around the training yard. All of you, enough. She looked around at the 3 figures who had shaped her awakening, seeing political calculations and ancient grudges and secrets that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. The Winter Court princess she had become felt naive and foolish for believing that anyone in this poisonous political landscape could be trusted completely. I don't know what's true anymore, she said, frost swirling around her in patterns that reflected her emotional chaos. But I know what happens tonight. You challenged me for the crown, Lady Seraphina. In the arena, with the kingdom watching. Nothing else matters until that's settled. Agreed, Seraphina said, her golden eyes gleaming with satisfaction. And when I kill you in front of everyone, when I prove that the Winter Court bloodline is too weak to rule, all these questions about the past will become irrelevant. She turned to leave, her guards falling into formation around her, but at the edge of the training ground, she paused to deliver one final blow. Sleep well tonight, princess, she called back, assuming you can, knowing that the man you thought loved you may have helped orchestrate your family's destruction. Then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and the lingering poison of doubt. Lyra stood in the centre of her circle of ice, staring at the Beast King and Oracle Matthias with eyes that held depths of winter magic and newly awakened wariness. The mate bond still hummed between her and the Beast King, but now it felt complicated, tainted by questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. "Is any of it true?" she asked quietly. The Beast King met her gaze steadily, his golden eyes holding pain that looked genuine. The treaty existed. I did sign it, hoping to avoid a war that would have consumed both kingdoms. But the moment I learned what had happened to the Winter Court, I knew I had been played, used as a political pawn to provide legitimacy to an atrocity. And you never told me. I was afraid, he admitted, afraid that if you knew about my involvement, even peripherally, you would reject the bond, Reject me. I have waited 800 years for you, Lorelei. I couldn't bear to lose you over mistakes made before I even knew you existed." Oracle Matthias stepped forward, his ancient features heavy with regret. "The fault is mine as well. I could have told you the full truth when I broke your suppression spell. I chose not to because I believed your awakening power was more important than political history." Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the crown on her head and the complex tangle of emotions in her chest. The servant girl she had been would have crumbled under this revelation, would have retreated into invisibility rather than face such painful complexity. But she wasn't a servant girl anymore. "Tonight I fight for my crown," she said, opening her eyes to look at both of them. "Tomorrow, if I'm still alive, we'll discuss what trust means and whether it can be rebuilt. But right now, I need to prepare to kill someone who definitely wants me dead." "Lyra," the Beast King started. "No," she cut him off, ice crystallizing in the air between them. "Right now, you're a political complication I can't afford. Tonight I fight alone." The pain in his expression was almost unbearable, but she forced herself not to look away. Leadership meant making hard choices, and the first one was learning to stand on her own power instead of relying on others to define her worth. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In 1 hour, she would either prove herself worthy of the Winter Court legacy or die in the attempt. And for the first time since her awakening, she would face that trial with no one to depend on but herself. The combat arena had been carved from living stone by the first Northern kings, designed to contain the most dangerous magical duels in the kingdom's history. Tonight it would witness the birth of a legend or the death of the last Winter Court heir. Lyra stood at the arena's entrance as sunset painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, listening to the roar of thousands of voices echoing from the amphitheatre beyond. Every citizen of the kingdom who could travel had come to witness the combat trial, drawn by the promise of spectacle and the chance to see their new queen either prove her worth or die in the attempt. The betting, she had learned, still favoured her death. "The rules are simple," the arena master explained, his scarred face impassive as he ran through protocols that hadn't been used in over a century. "Combat to the death or yield. No outside intervention. No weapons beyond what you carry onto the sand. Magic is permitted, encouraged, and expected." Lyra nodded, checking the balance of the ice-forged blade at her side one final time. She had created the weapon herself during the afternoon's preparation, channeling Winter Court magic into crystallized steel that would never dull and never break. It was beautiful and deadly, like everything her bloodline had ever created. "Lady Seraphina has already taken the field," the arena master continued. "She's impressive. Enhanced strength, fire magic that can melt stone, and combat training that suggests years of preparation for exactly this kind of trial." "Good," Lyra said, surprising him with the steel in her voice. "I wouldn't want to win against someone who wasn't trying their hardest to kill me." The arena master studied her with the kind of professional assessment that came from watching hundreds of fighters enter these gates, most never left alive. But something in her ice-blue eyes made him nod with what might have been respect. "The crowd is waiting, Your Majesty." Lyra walked through the tunnel that led from preparation chambers to the arena floor, each step echoing with supernatural power that made the ancient stone resonate like a struck bell. The roar of the crowd grew louder as she approached the opening, but underneath it she could hear something else. Her heart beating steady and strong despite everything. She emerged onto the sand to a wall of sound that hit her like a physical force. Thousands of voices raised in a mixture of cheers, jeers, and expectant bloodlust. Torches ringed the arena, casting dancing shadows across the circular fighting space that had seen the death of kings and the birth of legends. Lady Seraphina stood at the arena's centre like a golden flame given human form. She had transformed for the combat trial, revealing the true extent of power that had been hidden beneath layers of careful political manoeuvring. Her golden hair now moved with currents of fire magic, and her eyes blazed with supernatural light that turned her beauty into something fierce and terrible. The armour she wore seemed to be forged from molten gold, flowing and reshaping itself with each movement. This was no mere noble daughter seeking political advantage. This was a warrior who had been preparing for war. "Behold your false queen!" Seraphina called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheatre through magic that amplified sound. "A servant who thinks royal blood makes her worthy to rule. Tonight I will show you what real power looks like." She raised her hands, and fire erupted from her palms in controlled streams that wrote patterns of destruction across the arena sand. The crowd gasped at the display, some cheering for the spectacle, others looking uncertain about which contestant they wanted to survive. Lyra walked toward the centre of the arena without responding to the provocation, ice crystals forming in the air around her with each step. She had learned something important during the afternoon's revelations. Words were weapons used by people who weren't confident in their ability to win through strength alone. She was done with words. The arena master took his position at the edge of the fighting circle, his voice booming across the amphitheatre with ceremonial authority. "By ancient law and sacred tradition, we witness trial by combat for the crown of the Northern Kingdom. Lady Seraphina of the Southern Reaches challenges Queen Lyralee of the Winter Court. Combat begins at my signal and ends only with death or yield." Lyra drew her ice-forged blade, the crystalline steel singing with winter magic as it cleared its sheath. Across the circle, Seraphina summoned weapons of living fire, twin swords that burned with heat intense enough to turn sand to glass. "Any last words, servant girl?" Seraphina asked, her golden eyes fixed on Lyra's face with predatory hunger. "Yes," Lyra replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made the ancient arena stones resonate with recognition. "I am not a servant girl." "Begin!" the arena master shouted. Seraphina moved first, crossing the arena in a burst of supernatural speed that left trails of fire in the sand behind her. Her burning swords came down in a pattern designed to overwhelm through sheer aggression, forcing her opponent onto the defensive from the first exchange. But Lyra wasn't there when the blades arrived. Winter Court magic had always been about more than raw power. It was about patience, precision, and striking when your enemy least expected it. Lyra sidestepped the attack with fluid grace, her ice blade coming up to deflect one fire sword while frost spread from her free hand to create a barrier against the second. The collision of fire and ice magic sent steam billowing across the arena in clouds, thick enough to hide both fighters from the crowd's view. "Running already?" Seraphina's voice echoed from within the steam, tinged with mocking laughter. "How very servant-like of you." "Not running," Lyra replied, from a completely different direction, her voice carrying through the mist like winter wind. "Hunting." She struck from behind, ice blade aimed at the gap between Seraphina's golden armour plates, but her opponent spun with inhuman speed, fire swords coming up to block the attack in a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated both their faces through the steam. For the first time, Lyra saw real surprise in Seraphina's golden eyes. "You're faster than I expected," Seraphina admitted, pushing back against Lyra's blade with strength that should have been impossible for her frame. "You're exactly as arrogant as I expected," Lyra replied, disengaging and flowing backward like smoke. The steam began to clear, revealing both fighters circling each other with newfound wariness. Seraphina's initial assault had failed to achieve the quick dominance she'd planned, and now she was reassessing her opponent with the cold calculation of someone who had made a potentially fatal mistake. "Enhanced strength, fire magic, years of training," Lyra said conversationally as they moved in a deadly dance around the arena's centre. "But you're not used to fighting someone who doesn't fear you." "Fear is wisdom when facing superior power," Seraphina replied. but there was tension in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Superior?" Lyra smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "Let me show you what the Winter Court considers superior power." She opened herself to the magic that sang in her bloodline, not holding back, not trying to control or contain it. Ice erupted from the arena floor in jagged spears that forced Seraphina to leap and dodge with desperate agility. The temperature plummeted so quickly that the crowd's breath became visible clouds, and frost began forming on the arena's stone walls. But Lyra wasn't done. She gestured, and the spears of ice began moving, tracking Seraphina's position like living things. They drove her toward the arena's edge, forcing her into increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers, while Lyra advanced with implacable purpose. "Impossible!" Seraphina gasped, barely avoiding an ice spear that would have pierced her heart. "No one has that level of control!" Her words cut off as Lyra's blade found its mark, slicing through golden armor like it was silk. Blood flowed from the wound, steaming where it hit the supernaturally cold sand. "The Winter Court ruled for over 1,000 years, Lyra said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the arena stones sing in response. "We didn't do it through politics or marriage alliances. We did it through power that made kingdoms kneel." Seraphina snarled, abandoning defensive tactics for a berserker assault that filled the arena with walls of flame. Fire magic poured from her in waves that turned sand to glass and made the air itself shimmer with heat. Her twin swords became streams of molten destruction that carved burning channels through the arena floor. It was an impressive display of raw magical force. It wasn't enough. Lyra walked through the flames like they were gentle summer rain, ice armor forming around her that turned fire to harmless steam. Her blade cut through Seraphina's wild attacks with surgical precision, opening wounds that frost-burned even as they bled. "You want to know the difference between us?" Lyra asked as Seraphina stumbled backward, her golden armor cracked and bleeding from a dozen cuts. "I spent 23 years learning to survive against impossible odds. You spent 23 years expecting the world to hand you everything you wanted." "I am nobility," Seraphina gasped, desperation finally cracking her perfect composure. "I was born to rule, trained to lead." "You were born to serve someone stronger," Lyra interrupted, ice forming in the air around her hands like crystalline claws. "Tonight you learn what that means." The final exchange lasted less than a heartbeat. Seraphina lunged forward with everything she had left, fire swords aimed at Lyra's heart in a last desperate gambit. But desperation made her sloppy, and sloppiness was fatal against an opponent who had been forged in the crucible of absolute powerlessness. Lyra sidestepped the attack with fluid grace, her ice blade coming up in a cut that severed both of Seraphina's fire swords at the hilts. Before her opponent could react, frost spread from Lyra's free hand to encase Seraphina's feet in ice that rooted her to the arena floor. Then the ice blade found Seraphina's throat, sharp enough to draw blood but not deep enough to kill. Yet. The arena fell into complete silence, thousands of witnesses holding their breath as they watched the tableau unfold. Lady Seraphina, the golden beauty who had seemed invincible, trapped and bleeding at the mercy of the servant girl she had dismissed. "Yield," Lyra said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheatre, despite its softness. Seraphina's golden eyes blazed with hatred and humiliation, but also with something else. Recognition. She was looking at Lyra like she was seeing her clearly for the first time, understanding exactly what kind of power she had challenged. Seraphina began, then stopped, her gaze flickering toward the crowd of witnesses. "You can yield and live," Lyra continued, ice blades steady at her opponent's throat. "Or you can die here, on this sand, remembered as someone who let pride destroy them. Choose." For a moment that stretched like eternity, the outcome balanced on the edge of a blade. Then Seraphina's shoulders sagged, defeat written in every line of her body. "I yield," she said, the words barely audible, but carrying clearly in the supernatural silence. The crowd erupted into chaos. Cheers, shouts, The thunderous applause of thousands of voices raised in approval of their new queen's victory. But Lyra barely heard any of it. She was too busy staring into Seraphina's eyes, reading something there that made her blood run cold. This wasn't over. Seraphina's yield was tactical, not genuine. She would live to fight another day, and when that day came, she would be better prepared. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Lyra had proven that the Winter Court bloodline was strong enough to defend itself, that the servant girl was truly gone, replaced by a queen who could stand against any threat. She stepped back, releasing the ice that held Seraphina's feet, and turned to face the crowd of witnesses who were now undeniably her subjects. "I am Queen Lyralee of the Winter Court," she called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheatre through magic that resonated in bone and stone. "Does anyone else wish to challenge my claim?" The answering roar of approval shook the very foundations of the ancient arena. But in the royal box, watching with golden eyes that held centuries of pain and newfound pride, the Beast King realised something that changed everything. His mate no longer needed him to protect her. She was magnificent all on her own,